Today I'm joined by somebody I've never met before, which is new for me. His name's Toshit Panigrahi. Um, he is the one behind the Instagram account Poem Dictionary, where he is known for defining words poetically without defining them directly. I found it fascinating. I stumbled upon his page on the Explorer page, and then he followed me back and he liked my cartoons. So I was like, all right, this guy clearly has great taste. So I was like, we have to speak. So shit's really great to have you here.
Thanks.
So
Thanks for having
tell
me. I'm
tell,
super
tell our
excited.
audience a little bit more about yourself.
So about myself, I studied computer science many years ago in college. I went to BU, Boston University, and I work as a software engineer and product designer at a bunch of startups, but currently I work at Toast. It's a startup in Boston. I started there as an intern when we were 30 people, not knowing the company was going to blow up. And now we've grown to a couple thousand.
Wow.
Beyond work, sorry,
No, I said, wow, that's amazing.
beyond work, I like spending my time creating things. I design typefaces, and I have made one. I try to make one each year. I've done it for the past 3 years. I have two of them are actually behind me. And I love storytelling, but I don't have the time to write short stories, right? So instead, I write poetry. And I post them on Instagram, as you said, under the account Poem Dictionary, where I had the idea. I was like, hey, why can't I, why not define words through poems, try to invoke a more emotional meaning to them instead of just defining them, right? And as a hobby, I'm working on getting my pilot's license and like taking my car out to the track.
Awesome. How does a computer science graduate go from lines of Python to lines of poetry?
So believe it or not, the entire time up until I got to college, I thought that I was going to be a pre-med, right? I had applied to all my colleges as a biology major, and picked all the pre-med programs and whatnot, and it wasn't until the summer, you probably experienced this between high school and college, right? It's the one summer where you truly don't have anything to do,
Right. Right.
And it was then that, and I had always like wanted to make things, right? I was like fascinated watching like internet startups, tech startups, apps and whatnot were booming, and I was like, how do these things work? How are these things made, right? And so that was the first year. That summer was the first time I actually dabbled in coding, and I just started from the basics. It was like HTML and CSS. What are they, right? Then moved on to what is JavaScript? How do you connect to a database? How do you make a login page, right? And you kept iterating on that. And before I knew it, I was like, I could actually build my first idea. And it was in that like a week before college started, where I called up my advisor at BU and I was like, hey, I'm not interested in pre-med anymore. I want to switch to computer science, and they were able to do that. And so during my time at BU, I loved computer science, like the coursework, and I never thought of myself as a designer. And in fact, like when I would have ideas that I would want to make, I would always be looking out, I would be like, I got to find a good designer because I can't design for my life, right? Everything would look like so bad. And I realized that at the time, and even now, right, it's even for companies, it's really hard to hire great designers, right? Like they're out there, but just finding designers like takes time and effort. And obviously, as a college kid, I wasn't going to find someone. It was rather naive of me, right? So I was like, well, let me try learning something about it. Let me try, okay, this screen looks bad. How can I make it better, right? And there were enough resources, right? You have design sites and people who post on Dribble, especially, is like a site where people post like beautiful user interfaces. And I would go on there and be like, all right, well, here's my garbage, and here's something that looks really pretty. Can I copy it, right? And you copy it over and over again, and you see Uh, and then you realize, the nuances of it, right? Like how to position text, why type matters, how to, using color actually took me a long time. Everything I did was like black and white and gray. I didn't figure out how to use color for the longest time. But that's when somehow I stumbled into, like as I was practicing this, was at my first internship, which was like a 4-person startup in Boston. They hired me as a product management intern because I was still new to coding. I couldn't engineer well, but they hired me as a product management intern where I was asked to work on user interfaces for their app, and that's where I first got like some workplace exposure to it. And a few months later, I was connected with some of the folks at Toast, and at the time they hired me, I was a UI UX intern. Unbeknownst to me, I was the only person doing design at Toast at the time, and I was working on online ordering and some of our multi-unit operator backend stuff. But that was how I got how I got introduced to product design. Then after Toast, I left Toast after working there for like 9 months to go to a startup where I worked as a product designer, came back to Toast and have been at Toast ever since. But recently I made the change over. So after I graduated, I became a software engineer, to learn more about that field, be in the motions of it. And now I work in product design at Toast. Wow. So that was the long-winded answer to how I became a product designer.
I love that story. It's so how did you go? Now you have initially pre-med, then computer science, business, and then how did the seed come for this page? I find it such a simple concept that I've been defining words using poetry. It's so simple, but it's so clever. Like it's amazing how no one's ever thought of it. How did you come up with that?
Well, I knew I wanted to. There were a couple aspects to it, right? And it was before this, I had tried posting like user interfaces to Instagram, right? But the problem is like those can be really time consuming, and it felt, it could be a little time consuming, right? And like the audience for it, like the people, like it probably wasn't there, right? Wasn't probably the best place to be posting user interfaces. But I did notice that Instagram had a large amount of like poetry and writing and things like that, right? And I had wrote poems on and off for a few years, but none of them really reusable here because like these needed to be condensed, and like they had to like very quickly I had to like be able to tell you a story, right? Or define a word, right? I couldn't just like ramble on, right, aimlessly for something. And I knew that just posting the poem itself is not going to be enough, right? Like there's not, as a viewer, as a person who's consuming this content, right? Putting myself in, and it's sort of like what a designer does, right? I put myself in your shoes, right, as a user, and I say, if I come across this, what am I getting from this, right? And if it's just some text, and I wanted it to be really simple, right? Which is why I put just black square with white text, right? And because it had to be just about the content, right? But thinking about what a reader was going to get out of this, right? There had to be some sort of expectation. There has to be some sort of like, what do you call it? Like expectation of what you're going to provide, right? And I initially thought, I was like, oh, what if this is an unfolding story? What if through poems like this, right? I could tell you a story instead of writing you the short story all at once. But then a poem in the middle doesn't make sense, right? So that's when I realized that, hey, why not take a word, right? And I'll define it. The word will be the title of the poem, right? And my goal is I have to somehow, like, in order to make sure that I'm not wasting the reader's time, right? The message in the poem has to be related to that word, right? It has to be defining that word somehow. And how do you get engagement? How do you get people to click, swipe, whatever, right? And that's when I realized, I was like, wait, I should put the actual definition in the comic, right? Where you have to like see, you have to tap it or see more to see what the actual definition is, right? And this forces people to engage with it. And that, yes, and so it would just matter like putting myself in like the reader's shoes and saying, can I make you think about what you're seeing here? Just not just the content itself, right? But what's around the content, right? The message I'm delivering or the format I'm presenting it to you, and can it be fresh? And it took me a while, but I messaged, my followers, right? And there was this one man who did really nice calligraphy. And he was a teacher. He's a teacher in Japan, I believe. And he pointed out, he was like, hey, I came across your account at very good timing, because he was like, my class just finished reading Lover's Dictionary, right? And it turns out, I think the title was Lover's Dictionary, but it does a very similar thing where it takes a word and then the poem is somehow related to that word.
Oh, okay.
So it took a while, but I knew that it wasn't going to be, the idea was not going to be totally unique, right? I knew it couldn't be, because it's like, coming from the startup world, right? Like ideas are a dime a dozen, right?
Right.
I've sort of internalized that if you think of an idea, this is a personal philosophy, but I would tell myself that if you think of an idea, someone's probably already thought of it before, right? And like, or tried it in some form, right? And if they haven't, why doesn't it exist? There must be some blocker to this, right?
Right.
Maybe it's not economical, maybe it's just not possible, maybe legally it's not allowed, right? But it was sort of the same concept. I knew there had to be some notion of this somewhere.
That's a very, I've never thought about it that way. I know for me, at least when I think of ideas, I record them as fast as I can so that I don't lose them. But I think it's a humbling perspective you have there, which is to think, well, maybe my idea isn't so original, because maybe like, why hasn't this been out there? There's probably some good reason for that. I like that.
Right.
That's a good thing to keep in mind. I love how, if anyone who's seen your page knows that with every poem, it's very simple, it's shown, but you have the next photo is the notebook image of where you originally wrote the poem in your notebook. That I like that, because when you see that picture, you see that the work was made from a person and not just some impersonal being behind an anonymous page, right? I love that. So how did you decide to make that decision?
So the first ones didn't have it, right? And it was again this sort of thing of like, putting myself in the reader's shoes, right? And saying that, okay, well, now I've figured out a format where people actually engage with it, right? And then I was like, I have a friend named Sherry. She loves handwriting, right? And I would, and she's been like a fan of my page, and always helpful with like critiques and stuff, right? And I would send her the poem, and I posted the poem one day, and she gets back and she was like, oh, this and this, and I liked it and whatnot. And then I was like, oh, but do you know that this is not how it started, right? And then I sent her, I was at home, and I had the notebook, where I had written it, and I was like, Sherry, this is not where the poem started. Like, and I took a picture of it and sent it over to her. And because I know, one, she loves handwriting, and two, like, I wanted to genuinely show her like where the poem started and actually where it ended, right? And I then realized, I was like, wait, this adds a human dimension. Like, yes, the first picture for uniformity, it's black with some serif text on top of it. But you can expose this other human side of this, right? Where you can show a person's thinking, or my thinking in this case, right? From start to finish, right? Where it's not structured, it's not neat, it could be messy, right? But you only see, the first picture only shows you the final thing, right? Not the journey that you took to get there.
Right. That's funny you mentioned that. I'm actually another handwriting fanatic. I not only do I like the aestheticness of it, I have like photos and photos of handwritings I admire. I just saved up in my phone just because I want to emulate that one day. But I like analyzing it. Like if you heard of graphology, it looks at the strokes of the lines to tell more about
Yes.
people's personality. And I try out with my friends. Okay, send me a picture of your handwriting. Let me see what I get right. So that's interesting. So for me, I really appreciate that touchy graph. But when I was thinking about how one comes up with this kind of poem, is it difficult at all to provide like a subjective account of a word? Because you see the word and I mean you have some sort of mental definition of what you think it means to you. Um, how is that? How do you portray that given that there is an objective denotative definition of the word?
Yeah. So it depends on the word, right? Uh, and it's sometimes a game of which came first, the poem or the word, right? And yeah, I'm not gonna lie. Sometimes I think of the poem first, and then I try to find a word that fits it,
Interesting.
right?
Okay.
Like there was uh, there was a poem. It was a snow squall poem, and it was the day that we had up here in Boston. We had a really bad snowstorm that day, and it was just like the snow was coming down, and like everything was closed, and it was really disrupted. And I was just sitting there, and I was like, um, I have to write about this blizzard, right? Because it was like dumping like feet and feet of snow, and I just
Yeah.
come through like Chicago and everything, right? And I was like, I have to write this, and uh, I wrote it, and then I was like, well, what word do I put this under? Because uh, blizzard is not a great word, but then I realized that a good word was like snow squall, right? That's not a word that I had heard before, and it basically describes heavy winds and a whiteout condition, right? That comes in suddenly. And I, it's not, you know, it's not possible to, give you an exact definition, right? If I'm not direct with it, right? But how many times has someone asked you for the meaning of a word, right? And when we try to, let's think about what happens when we try to define a word for someone, right? We're obviously not going to like give you a textbook definition, right?
Right.
But
Right.
we describe it the best we can, obviously by not using the word, right? We use other words to describe it, right? And the meaning is never 100% accurate, right? Uh, but it's enough to let the other person know what it means, right? And if I can get you, like you might see a word, right? If I told you lethologica, right, you might not remember what that word means, right? If I just told you, oh, it means, trying to think of a word, right? Or word at the tip of your tongue, like you might not remember that. But if I told you the imagery of a person doing crossword, right, and that crosswords are very similar to poems, right, you likely won't forget that image, right? Or if you take fluvial, for example, right, of or relating to a river, right, and it's fluvial was an interesting one because it was not a remarkable word by any means, right? It's not too common of a word, but it doesn't mean anything special. It just means of or relating to a river, right? But the challenge with that one is, and that one was one where the word came first, and with that, I was like, well, how do I tell you that this is related to a river, right? It's not enough for me to just tell you, describe your river, right? Uh, but instead, what if I told you a story, right? Where in, in the end, right? Like that impression, that emotion it created makes you remember that, hey, yes, her love was like a river, right? It washed me out, right? In the
Yeah.
end.
I love that.
So it just makes that a little bit more memorable.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That we remember stories better than we do just dates or information. I mean, when I look through these poems, I find myself like, hey, I remembering this word that I didn't even expect to remember because the image is like, oh, I thought of like procrastination. I thought about the Christmas image that you showed. I was like, that's good. Um, when you so like I was when you before we did this, you told me that it was interesting that your pursuits out of work tend to be artistic, even though you never consider yourself an artistic person. You said, I quote, "I've come to realize art underlies the best work in many fields." What does that mean exactly?
Oh, so, a little bit of context for this, right? Like, I growing up, English was not my strong suit ever growing up. Like, and like, uh, the situation is that I was born in India and lived in Abu Dhabi for a while. Then we moved to like California, then Colorado, then New Hampshire. And so I think I moved a total of like 8 or 9 times, right, by the time I got to college. Um, and so we're moving quite a bit. In the middle, we went back to India and lived there for a year. Uh, and, as a person who did not speak English for, many years, right, until I was forced to, basically in Abu Dhabi, like, English is like the language of instruction, right, at the school. And so at that point, I had to really pick up English, and that always, like, there was an insecurity in the back of my mind that, like, English is not my native language here, right? And it didn't help that I was also really good at math and science, right? Growing up, and so I was like, and over here in the West, especially, we have this this duality that there's a left brain and this right brain, right? Obviously, there's a little bit of there's some interconnectedness between them, but in general, that you're very analytic people and you have artistic people, right? As if you wanted to broadly describe people. But I, growing up, middle school and whatnot, in high school, English was not my strong suit, and I had always like been like, oh, math and science is my thing, and it became really humbling when I did my 8th grade in India, and over there, it became the opposite. I was really bad at math and science compared to everyone over there, and I was really good at English.
Wow. Okay.
Coming from the US, going over there, right? And then I think that was, especially because I was like in 8th grade at the time, it was a shock to my system because I realized it's a matter of perception, right? That in context, right? Where you could actually be good at something, right? And you likely, in some other situation, will likely be good at something, right? But it's really, how we choose to look at ourselves, right? And define and tell the story of how we are. Which is why later on, even though I was coding and I was studying computer science, I had the belief that, I could learn something about design, right? Maybe I might not be the best one, but I could learn it, right? But when I mean that art, what is art, right? Like, in order for the answer to make sense, I have to, like, what is art, right? If I pose that question to you, right? The way I think about it is, and obviously art has many forms, right? You have dance, you obviously have art pieces, you have music, you have architecture, interfaces, whatever it is, right? But what is the commonality between all of them, right? And really, what art is, from my my opinion, art is basically the ability to arrange these disparate pieces, right? Pieces that by themselves mean nothing, but in a particular arrangement evoke an emotion. Right?
Okay.
And that, if you look at like great paintings, great architecture, great even stories, right? It's like obviously literature, it's a form of art, right? But it's one thing for the author to say, what is not art is for them to say, hey, feel bad, right? Like directly telling you to feel bad, right? But if they can create a situation where you fall in love and you experience heartbreak and you really hate that antagonist, right? With a passion, right? And you have to go tell the next person about it, right? That was art, right? That came from literature, right?
Right.
Buildings have the ability to say, like, the moment you walk in to some, some beautiful architectural pieces, there's just this feeling of, some of them will make you feel really small and insignificant, right? And some of them will make you focus only on yourself, right? And they give you this heightened awareness, right?
Right.
And that's the architect being able to induce that emotion through pieces that, by themselves, if you took a floorboard or you took a desk, it means nothing, right? And the same goes for, how you put colors on a screen, and the same goes for words that you put in a poem, right?
Wow.
One of those sentences alone might not mean anything, but if I can arrange it with the right words, right, then I can get you to feel an emotion, like, whether I say whether it's fluvial, whether it's lithological, like any of those other poems that I've talked about, right, where I can bring out an emotion without ever telling you about it,
Okay.
right? And so when I say that art, I think, underlies good work from many fields, I think when you can do something many times over and over again, right? And at one point you'll become really good at it, but then what comes next, right? Even if it's writing code, right? And I realized that, I was seeing a dichotomy at where I saw, engineering, and at home at the time I was working on one of these typefaces. And what really gave me an understanding of, and it took me a long time to come to this understanding of art, was that was while I was working on one of these typefaces, right? Because it just happened to be one of those things where I'm hunched over a computer, and it was like meditative. I liked it. You're hunched over a computer, modifying one letter, one stroke of one letter, a millimeter to the left or right? And you're trying to figure out, does it look balanced? Does it not look balanced, right? And, there's no right answer, right? Typefaces do all sorts of funky things, right? As long as it looks like the letter is supposed to, it's legible, looks like the letter, it's correct, right? There are things about optical illusions and correcting for them and whatnot, right, that have their place. But it was largely an exercise where it was this practice of over and over every night for many hours. I would look at, this A looks too happy. This A does not look right? This A needs to be more serious, right? Then you move on to the next letter, and it's like, okay, the B next to the A, like the B does not follow, the theme, right? It does not follow. That gave me an understanding of how to use those elements, like lines, darkness, right? The only thing you have is like the stroke of the letter and the white next to the white space, right? And it was an exercise in saying that, each of these letters, is it conveying the right emotion, right? When you put like combinations of letters together, does it look right? Does it look, as this one is, does it look futuristic, right? Does it tell you, like something about it that's very high tech versus, something like the yellow one, right? It's like, it's way more jovial, it's way more inviting and warm, right? And somehow, I didn't realize it was happening at the time, but that carried over, and I started seeing things in a different way, right? Even at work, you have software engineers who are at some of the best software engineers I've ever met at work, right? And you realize that what they're doing, they review my own code, and comment on it, critique it, tell me to change things. What you realize is that even that in itself, you look at some of the architecture and how they solution things, and you realize that that also is a form of art. Like, you might need a different understanding. You might need to know, what is being presented, right, in order to understand why this solution is really beautiful, why it's really elegant, right? And obviously, I'm not an abstract maths person, but mathematicians also believe that there are really elegant proofs. There are proofs that
I've heard this, yeah.
There are really elegant proofs. There are proofs that make you. There are physics equations that make them tear up, right? And so, unfortunately, though, I think it comes down to failing in education. I think all too often, in schools, we're like, all of these, STEM subjects, and then there's like art is like painting, right?
Right.
It's and never realize that it's actually like, once you become really good at something, right, you can understand Yeah, and it's things I apply at work as well, right? Like you work on something and it's not enough to just get the design that works, but like, can we put in just a little bit more where you look at it and the first time you open the app, the first time you add something to your cart, it makes you just feel happy, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's what I
So,
mean when I see that art underlies like many work in many fields.
so for you, art is the reconfiguration of ordinary elements so that it produces this response is what you're looking for.
Right.
That's a good way to put it. Wow. So when you said that, whether it's the words or poems or architecture or cartoons, that we're all looking after exposing those little truths in subtle ways to people, is this that's what you're regarding there?
Yeah, I think that is specific to uh, I think our art is a little bit more general than that, but I think in the poem dictionary account through the poems, right? Putting myself in the position of like, what am I telling the reader, right? Or why would someone read this? I try to find those little truths, those nuances, those things that you might be able to relate to, in order for you to receive the message better.
I see. Did you have any poets that you like to read, or did you just sort of create your poetry based on just personal endeavors?
Uh, so I I have read a couple Sylvia Plath works. Her name, unfortunately, this is probably really bad. I don't know too much about her, but her name had popped up a lot of in a lot of articles, and so I started looking into some of her work. Um, there was Billy Collins was another one, but Billy Collins
Oh
does a
yeah,
lot
he's
of
great. I like him.
prose,
Very funny.
and I loved how Billy Collins sometimes like adds twists to his poems, but he has the luxury of like being able to do it through the course of a page, right? Uh,
Right.
but I wanted to figure out like, can I do those twists, more succinctly?
Uh-huh.
But I think the biggest influence was a poet named Long Leave.
Okay.
She there's a couple there's a couple books by her, but her book Lullabies is just so fantastic. It's super emotional, but she's someone I admire a lot.
Okay. Awesome. That's so. Now, before we close up today, I will ask you the question that I always ask everyone. What is a quote or some words that you're thinking about that you would like to share with us today? It can be anything as long as it means something to you. I think this question is more suitable for you than probably anyone else I've ever done because you are the word guy.
I think the one that, and it probably makes sense in the context of many of the things that I've told you, but I think the one thing that really every time, I remember the first time I heard it, I was like really shaken, and then I you know remember it all the time, and it's that uh, the master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried. And that one, just the what that is trying to tell you, right? That one, it's like okay to fail, right? That it's not. And I think the reason it made such an impact on me at the time was that I had this, it was this notion that I had incorrectly, that for startups, right, you have an idea and it may work. It's like a lottery. You try it may work, and in some ways it is, right? You have to get lucky for it to work. But it's not that, hey, you try, boom, right, success or failure, you try, boom, success or failure. Instead, it's actually like a road, right? You try, you fail, you fail, you fail, and eventually you keep tweaking, you keep iterating, and eventually something may work, right? And failure, I think, is stigmatized way too much, right? And there are so many like projects I've started that I was just like, this is absolute garbage. Like, this is like, I'm not pursuing this anymore. But it's it's a quote, it's like they're words of wisdom, which when I feel frustrated or when I feel like I failed at something, right, where it's like it's okay, right, this is part of the learning process, right, and it's not that anyone some people are I'm not one of them, but there are some people who are like naturally born, and you look at it and they're like, oh yes, they're a very talented singer, right, and there are a few examples like that here and there, but by and large, if you look at it, people who are good in their fields, they have put in a lot of effort, right, and I think there is something I admire very much about that, honing your craft, doing something over and over and over again, really understanding it. Because in the end, what happens is, you fail multiple times, you try multiple times, but that effort is not wasted.
Right.
You elevate your craft basically to that point where, you can produce art,